And then I'm now going to, you should now see the PowerPoint slide any second now.
Yes.
Can you see the PowerPoint slide? So it says LCSE afternoon call regs.
Yes.
Cool. And as previously discussed, what we're going to do today is we're going to be talking about Rule 8, which is action to avoid collision. So that the third part in our triumvirate, I guess. Just trying to open my, every time I change all these settings, all the view of you all changes. So I'm just adjusting the settings so we're ready to go. Okay, so action to avoid collision. It's split into two parts. And because I'm a bluff old traditionalist, we'll do part one first. It's pretty much, the part 1A pretty much does what it says on the tin, I think. So any action taken to avoid collision shall be taken in accordance with the rules of this part. So you need to understand the rules. And if the circumstances of a case admit, be positive, made in ample time, and with due regard to the observance of good seamanship. I think it's pretty straightforward until you really try and examine that. So what does positive mean? What does ample time mean? And what does due regard to the observance of good seamanship mean? They're not normal phrases. They're fairly, they're not ambiguous. But I think but they're not specific, are they? It doesn't say any action should be taken 5 minutes before collision, or 2 miles before, or when you first observe it, or immediately, or there's a little bit of vagueness there, which is useful and allows us to apply a little bit of common sense. Does that make sense to everyone? And I don't know how many of you are walking out in parks or jogging or cycling at the moment, but I see people kind of doing what I'd expect to be happening out on the water now, more and more in normal public interactions in London. So, or certainly in Bushy Park, where people are approaching crossroads on the pathways, and some people are slowing down to allow other people to go forward, and they're indicating to each other, I'm going to run this way if you run that way, and people are generally doing, there's not a set of rules which we're following, but people are using common sense and decency and looking out ahead and making sure that they make other people aware of what they're doing, which makes it all happen quite easily, is my experience anyway. And I think this is more or less what the rules are saying as well from a maritime perspective. Has anyone got any contribution on this part of the rule?
Just that the first one, you make it clear. So if you're going to take avoiding action, you make a definite turn to demonstrate to the other boat that you've seen them and you're actually moving and avoiding them.
Yeah, again, the rule, we'll see in a minute, Anna. The rules go on to talk about that absolutely specifically. So this is a general overriding clause, I think. Happy days? And this is exactly what you were talking about, Anna. So any alteration of course and or speed to avoid collision shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, be large enough to be readily apparent to another vessel observing visually or by radar, and specifically a succession of small alterations of course or speed should be avoided. So the pictures there are meant to be showing you, I don't know if you can see that in picture B, the rib has altered maybe 10 degrees to starboard, but you can hardly see that as an observer. But by making a 20-30 degree alteration, it's clearly shown a change in aspect, and you can see what he's doing. Does that make sense? And the same if you're, so in some respects, altering course is easier to see than altering speed. But the same is true if you're going to alter speed as well. You don't want to be just nudging half a knot off here or there. You want to be slowing down properly or turning in a big circle in order to enable the other vessel to see what you're doing and see that you're making a lot of sea room for them. Does that make sense? And it talks about radar, and what I would say is this is even more, if you're in reduced visibility, your maneuver has to be even more accentuated, because it takes time for that perception of change of course or perception of change of speed to show up on a radar, because you don't have the same acuity that you do when you're looking at something visually. Happy? What you might also want to think about with this rule is that at night, when you're looking at a light, you don't see a light turn, you just see a light shine. Does that make sense to what I'm saying? So you need to make your alteration big enough that an observer can see that you've changed your aspect. Now, if you're a big merchantman, and if you can remember, you've got two masthead lights on a merchantman. So I'm illustrating those with my fists here. If I turn my fists, you can see that the distance between the masthead lights changes. So you can see a big vessel maneuvering and how it maneuvers at night. If you're a small vessel like a yacht, in order to go from showing a red aspect to a green aspect, or a red aspect to a stern aspect, you may be having to make a 60 or 70 degree alteration to make that alteration clear at night. Does that make sense? So yeah. If that doesn't make sense, then draw the arcs of visibility of the navigation lights out on a piece of paper, and then think about how far you've got to turn to show to show an observer a change of aspect at night. If there's sufficient sea room, alteration of course alone may be the most effective action to avoid a close quarters situation, provided that it is made in good time, it is substantial, and does not result in another close quarters situation. What's the problem as sailors with this advice? Well, not a problem, but this actually, what as sailors, this is what the kind of normal thing we do. We normally consider an alteration of course, don't we? And then it will be when we move on to the next part of the rule, you'll understand what I'm saying. But an alteration of course, you need to consider where you're manoeuvring to and where you will be and what other users are doing around you, so that you don't create another close quarters situation. I think that's fairly obvious, isn't it? Not always easy to do, and you might need to make a series of alterations. Now, in my experience, if you make an alteration, you should make the alteration such that the close quarters situation which is developing disappears as quickly as possible, and then you can resume your current track. So if you're turning for a short period of time and then coming back, you reduce the risk of this happening in terms of a second close quarters situation substantially. Does that make sense? The other thing from my experience is that you don't make these decisions necessarily hastily. You should be this is part of what the first clause was talking to about good seamanship. And then previous days we've talked about lookout and monitoring of the situation. And this should be this is so we have the situational awareness that we can consider a situation and then make a maneuver. We don't see something and immediately take a maneuver. We consider it and then make a maneuver. And as an officer of the watch, certainly in the Royal Navy, you have to communicate your intention to maneuver to the commanding officer before you make the maneuver. So actually the period from observing, deciding, getting clearance and then maneuver can be up to about 5 minutes. So you need to make your event horizon further ahead in order that you can fulfill the obligations in this part of the rule. Does that make sense, guys?
Yes.
Action taken to avoid collision with another vessel shall be such to result in passing at a safe distance. The effectiveness of the action shall be carefully checked until the other vessel is passed and clear. What is the definition of safe distance?
Leaving enough room to maneuver, I guess.
depends on the other vessel how much the speed and.
So I think what you're saying is you need to leave enough room for the other vessel depending on its ability to maneuver and its speed. Is that correct, Ed?
Yes. Yes.
I think that's broadly true. So a safe distance from a rib is completely different to a safe distance from this oil tanker, isn't it? So I would. It's a couple of. I would always work on a couple of boat lengths. So maybe more when you're crossing ahead. So 5 boat lengths when you're crossing ahead, and a couple of boat lengths if you're passing down the beam or astern of a vessel. And that ties in quite nicely with the kind of distances that Southampton VTS require you to keep clear of vessels which are operating in the precautionary zone. So you need to remain more than 1,000 meters ahead clear and more than 500 meters either side. So it would be, that's about five or six boat lengths maybe for a 200 meter vessel, and a couple of boat lengths either side. Does that make sense? And I think if you were to look at something similar for yachts or ribs, you find that those kind of distances make sense. Happy? What about the effectiveness of the action should be carefully checked until the other vessel is finally passed and clear? What are they getting at there? Anyone wants to jump in? Go on, Nigel.
You don't want it changing direction and sort of cancelling out the manoeuvre you have just taken.
That's one of the things that could happen, certainly. So you want to make sure that where you've taken action, he hasn't suddenly decided to take avoiding action, and the combined effect could be compounding and make the situation more rapidly closing. What you want to make sure is what you assessed is going to happen is actually happening. Does that make sense? So you might assume that a 30-degree alteration of course is enough to make the bearing of the boat move one way or the other. But particularly if you're moving at slow speed in tidal waters, you can sometimes find that a big course alteration doesn't make a huge difference in the way that the boat's performing in terms of how it's crossing the ground. So you might have made an alteration, but really you're still closing pretty much on the same course as you were before. And if you're not watching what's happening, you'd be making a mistake based on your initial assumption. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yep.
And when it says passed and clear, what it means is just keep watching until it's absolutely gone away. Don't just, so when I make when I see a vessel, I decide that I'm going to take an action, I take the action, and then I'm watching it. And there's a point where I go, okay, well that's working, that's fine, I don't need to worry about that. But I don't stop watching it. You know, I keep going back and keep monitoring it until I know that it's well beyond my quarter and I'm clear and it's not going to impact me unless it turns 180 degrees and tries to drive me down again. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
If necessary to avoid collision or allow more time to assess the situation, a vessel shall slacken her speed or take all way off by stopping or reversing her means of propulsion. This is what I was tripping myself up on earlier. So is it easy for a yacht to reverse its means of propulsion when we're under sail?
No.
No. So we can, the best we can do is we can slow down. And what would be the procedure which we slow down?
Scandalise the sails.
Scandalise the sails, ease the sails out, luff up. If luffing up works and isn't confusing to the situation. Or I guess heave to is the formal way of doing it. The other thing you can do is, I think I mentioned it a couple of days ago, you can sail in circles. Sailing in circles is also another good way to give yourself time to assess the situation. What else could you do to give yourself control and slow yourself down quickly if there was a situation developing?
Drop
You could put
sails,
the engine-
put the engine on. Yeah.
You put the engine on, you use the engine to slow you down, and ultimately drop the sails. Depending on how your sail is configured, that may or may not be easier. But so furling a wedge, it might be relatively straightforward. Does that make sense? Happy?
Mm-hmm.
So vessel B is the darker vessel at the top right in this diagram. They were approaching on so risk of collision exists, and vessel A has made a large alteration, of course. It's positive, it can made in ample time, it's seaman-like, so it's an alteration, of course, to starboard, so it results in passing astern of the other vessel, and it's easily seen by an observing ship. Happy? So that's the perfect and the normal kind of thing that we'd expect to see happening in a crossing situation. Part two can appear fairly confusing and is fairly convoluted. Now, we haven't covered when and where a vessel should not impede the passage of another vessel, but there are two places really. One is in narrow channels, this applies, and the other is in traffic separation schemes. And vessels under 20 metres in length, sailing vessels and crossing vessels, are required not to impede the passage of vessels in traffic separation schemes or narrow channels. And this is specifically different to give way. So where you're required not to impede the passage of another vessel, when the circumstances of the case admit, you should take early action to avoid sufficient sea room for the safe passage of the other vessel. So this rule applies where you are not to impede the vessel. Does that make sense? It's different to give way. Happy? And what it's saying, that there are no ifs and buts. If you're required not to impede the safe passage of another vessel, you should take early and substantial action to keep clear. Make sense? Part two says that the vessel required not to impede the safe passage of another vessel is not relieved of this obligation if it's approaching the other vessel so as to involve risk of collision, and shall when taking action have full regard to the action which may be required to the rules of this part. What this is saying is that if you're required not to impede the vessel and risk of collision exists, you still have to not impede the vessel. Does that make sense? So it might be if you're in a crossing situation. So let's go back to the previous slide. So if that dark blue vessel, so if the light blue vessel rather was in a narrow channel, and the dark blue vessel was required not to impede it, the light blue vessel would continue on its merry course, yeah? And the dark blue vessel would be required to keep clear of it, despite being in normal circumstances the give way vessel. Sorry, the stand-on vessel. Does that make sense, guys? And the easy way to do this, understand these first two parts, is the first part says if you're required not to impede, keep clear, and the second part still says if you're required not to impede, keep clear, whatever. Does that make sense? And then the third part of the rule talks to the vessel which is not to be impeded. So this is the vessel which is protected. So the vessel which is happily transiting along a narrow channel or transiting along a traffic separation scheme, it remains fully obliged to comply with the rules of this part when the two vessels are approaching one another so as to involve risk of collision. So to be clear, vessel A is not to impede. It happens to be the stand-on vessel if it was normally a crossing situation. He still shouldn't impede. But for whatever reason, vessel A is beginning to impede and a risk of collision is developing. then vessel B, this is the protected vessel, is required to understand what it would normally do as a giveaway vessel and take action as required by the rules in order to avoid collision. You can't just carry on and drive into the other vessel and say, well, he wasn't, I had the right, was nothing to do with me. He was meant to keep out of my way. Does that make sense? So the rules say, don't impede whatever. And then they say, if you are impeded, you need to avoid collision in accordance using the rules of this part. Does that make sense, guys? It's fairly complicated, and it's for a very specific set of circumstances, which I think happened in the 70s when traffic separation schemes first started to proliferate. But nevertheless, it's worth understanding. Basically, as far as we're concerned, as yachtsmen, we're either normally always in vessels under 20 meters in length or less, and sailing vessels. Quite a lot of places where we're required not to impede the safe passage of another vessel. Basically, guys, give them lots of sea room. Happy? That's me for today. Has anyone got any questions or observations? Another 20-minute little run through.
All good, thanks, Mike.
Still proving useful, guys.
Yeah, very much.
Yes, yes,
Absolutely.
thank you.
One comment from me, if I may.
Very useful.
Go on then, Stephen.
It's and I'm sure you will remember this. It's always worth remembering that a safe distance is, as you were saying, is. Oh, I think we've just been disconnected. Anyway, thanks for the.
No, you're still there. You're still there.
Okay. I think it's always worth remembering that the safe distance varies, and if you're on the bridge of a super tanker that takes a number of miles to stop, then it's going to get very nervous about your proximity if you're the giveaway vessel. So it's always a good idea where the room allows to take action really early to give big seagoing vessels the comfort that a risk isn't developing.
Cool, that's awesome. Good point, Stephen. Okay, guys, I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll be doing narrow channels.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good.
Thanks.
This evening,
Mike.
did any of you coming to do the tidal stream problems?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
You
I'll
been,
do that.
were the questions clear enough and the packs good enough to work through?
Haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
But you've seen the link to them, yeah?
Yes.
Good. Catch you later, guys.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have you got 2 seconds to hang on, Stephen Cameron?
Sure. Yep.
Are we all good? I think. Is everyone else gone?
No, I seem to still be in. I'll try and get out.
How are you, mate?
All right. Actually, what about you?
Very, very well. But quite a bit of a loose end, though.
Yes.
All my work's dropped off the side of a cliff. Are you busy?
I'm busy doing the work that we had where this started, but there are no signs of. There's not much in the way of new stuff at the moment. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's all a bit worrying, really. But there's. One can try and be creative, and I'm sure there are other things that we can do. And I think doing things like this, running these sort of events, I think it's great because it keeps them, keeps us stimulated, and it helps you keep your profile up as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting learning how to do it. It's not something that I've done a lot before. Is it coming across okay?
Yes, it is. It's nice and clear, and the way that you break down the rules and into their constituent parts, I think is really helpful, because I've got them open in front of me, the MCA coal regs, and I'm reading the narrative straight off the coal regs, and you need to be an expert in understanding the way they're written, because they're not easy to understand.
But I think they're beautiful once you start getting into them. I think they're an amazing set of rules.
Yeah. So I think this has been really good, and I've just done my Yachtmasters Coastal Theory, so it's good to keep up to date on all these things. And I was surprised at how much I'd forgotten. Actually, it was a bit of a shock.
There's some that say I'll tell people when we do the restricted viz bit that whenever I get myself in restricted viz, I always pull the book off the shelf and have a read through it. Some of the stuff you don't use often enough to need to have it at the tips of your fingers.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I can remember standing in on the bridge of a ship, and you're what looks like adequate manoeuvring room to a little yacht isn't the same for a big ship, partly because of your size, but also because of your speed as well. If you're doing, say you're on a container ship and you're doing 18 knots, in 3 or 4 minutes, you've travelled quite a long way, right?
Yeah. So my assessment's the reverse now, to be honest. So because if a ship can see you on radar, and particularly if it's on AIS, you'd be really quite confident on how a boat's tracking and it's going to miss you. And ships are happy to pass far closer than they were previously because there's less doubt in it. So I would say that merchantmen will pass 1 or 2 cables from a yacht quite happily in the middle of the channel, and to be honest, that's not undangerous. It's not a dangerous distance. So if you think about if you're sailing in the Solent, you're passing big container vessels at similar distances all the time, and you don't bat an eyelid about it. But when you're out in the middle of the channel, it feels really bloody close, because you're suddenly in the middle of nowhere and this big merchantman's like right next door to you. So I think if you want to feel comfortable, you need to think about what level of comfort you're happy to take and how you're going to experience that. And you probably need to have seen it a couple of times before you, as a skipper, are able to make that judgment. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, absolutely. And I found on the yachts that I've been on, having AIS is a absolute a godsend, because you've got such a low height of eye that your horizon of visibility is only about 3 miles, right? So if you've been tracking something on AIS before it appears visually, you know roughly where it's going to appear from, and you know what it's doing, and you know whether you need to have taken avoiding action or not. But if the first time that you're aware of it is when you see it visually, you don't have, another 5 minutes has passed by the time you've worked out what it's doing, and and it can be getting pretty close, right? So AIS is a huge benefit.
I think it's a huge boon, and but I've seen other things happen. So you can become in the ground wave of a ship's AIS. So actually, when a ship gets to about 1.5 miles away from you, when it's a big ship, you can sometimes, because its transmitter's so high, you become in its shadow, and that can be quite scary if you're relying on AIS. And also, I quite often just turn the AIS off on cross-channel trips to get my skippers to do it by eye, because I think if you're, I think AIS as an aid to collision avoidance is really useful. If you over rely on it, then you're not ground truthing what the machine's telling you, and that can be dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, there's too many examples these days of masters coming on the bridge of the ship and saying to the navigator on the bridge of a merchant vessel, saying, "What's that ship doing over there?" And the first thing